The Forgotten Experiment, written by Derek J. Kenmuir. In the damp, misty forests of Richmond, British Columbia, stood a facility hidden from prying eyes. This wasn't just any building. It was a labyrinthine fortress of concrete and steel, shrouded in secrecy and the scent of pine. The year was 1976, a time when the world outside was blissfully unaware of the horrors being concocted within. The facility was surrounded by a high chain-link fence topped with razor wire, and guard towers with searchlights stood like sentinels at each corner, casting eerie beams of light into the surrounding fog. The constant hum of generators and the occasional bark of guard dogs added to the oppressive atmosphere. The facility itself was a maze of interconnected buildings, some of them partially submerged underground. Long, dimly lit corridors connected various labs, offices, and living quarters. The walls were lined with outdated yet sophisticated equipment, their blinking lights and soft hums creating an almost hypnotic rhythm. The air was perpetually cool, the chill seeping into the bones of those who worked there, reminding them constantly of the cold, clinical nature of their mission. Overhead, fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting long, eerie shadows that danced across the concrete floors. The ceiling was low and oppressive, making the entire place feel like a claustrophobic labyrinth. Dr. Rachel Kingston had always been a woman of science. Her sharp intellect and insatiable curiosity had driven her to the cutting edge of genetic research. Yet, behind her determined gaze lay shadows of past failures, a burden she carried silently. Her last project had ended in scandal, the promising genetic therapy causing unforeseen and catastrophic mutations. The public outcry had nearly ended her career, but it had also ignited a relentless drive to prove herself. The memory of her last patient, a young girl whose life had been destroyed by Rachel's failed therapy, haunted her dreams. She often awoke in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the girl's accusing eyes staring back at her from the darkness. Rachel's childhood had been marked by a fascination with the natural world. She spent hours in the woods near her home, collecting insects and studying plants. Her father, a biology teacher, too nurtured her curiosity, and by the time she was in high school, Rachel was determined to become a scientist. Her academic journey was a series of successes, each achievement building her reputation until the fateful day when her experiment went wrong. The scandal that followed left her ostracized by her peers, but also more determined than ever to redeem herself. When the government approached her with a proposition, one that promised groundbreaking advancements, she saw it as a chance to redeem herself. The offer was shrouded in mystery, presented by men in dark suits and sunglasses who spoke in hushed tones. The secrecy only added to its allure. Rachel's curiosity was piqued, and she couldn't resist the opportunity, despite the nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach. She remembered the initial meeting vividly, the sterile boardroom, the thick dossier marked classified, and the unyielding gaze of the officials who offered her the second chance she so desperately needed. Arriving at the facility, Rachel was greeted by the stern, unyielding face of Major Tom Harris. He was a man of few words, his eyes revealing a lifetime of buried trauma. He wore a military uniform, crisp and immaculate, with medals that hinted at a storied past. His presence was commanding, and his voice, gravely from years of barking orders, brooked no argument. "Welcome, Dr. Kingston," Major Harris said. "I trust you understand the gravity of our project here." Rachel nodded, her eyes scanning the room filled with outdated yet formidable equipment. "Creating a super soldier," she murmured, the words heavy with implication. Her eyes, a steely grey, reflected the clinical coldness of the room, but deep within them a spark of curiosity and determination burned. "Precisely," Harris replied, his stern face softening just a touch. "And we have high hopes for your contributions." His eyes, dark and intense, conveyed a mixture of respect and expectation. She was introduced to her team. Dr. Samuel Blake, a grizzled three-veteran scientist with a perpetual scowl and a hidden history of moral compromises, and Karen Lee, a bright-eyed lab assistant whose naivety was both refreshing and alarming. Dr. Blake had seen too much, done too much in the name of progress. His hands were steady, but his eyes were haunted by past mistakes. He rarely spoke of his previous work, but the scars on his psyche were evident in his weary gaze and the deep lines etched into his face. Karen, on the other hand, was a bundle of energy, eager to prove herself, her eyes wide with the excitement of being part of something so significant. Her youthful enthusiasm contrasted sharply with the grim determination of her colleagues. Blake's background was a tragic tale of ambition turned sour. He had started his career with high ideals, working on promising projects that aimed to cure diseases and improve human health. But over time, the compromises he made, the corners he cut, and the ethical lines he crossed began to weigh on him. The culmination of his moral descent was a project that ended disastrously, leaving several patients permanently damaged and Blake a broken man. His involvement in the Richmond project was a chance for him to find some semblance of redemption, though he doubted he deserved it. Karen's story was one of hope and determination. Coming from a humble background, she was the first in her family to attend college. She had worked tirelessly to earn her degree, motivated by a desire to make a difference in the world. Her enthusiasm and naivety were a stark contrast to the seasoned cynicism of her colleagues. She looked up to Rachel, seeing her as a role model and a beacon of what she could one day become. The project's objective was clear: to enhance human capabilities through genetic and psychological conditioning. The facility's hallways were a maze of sterile white corridors, each turn identical to the last, creating a disorienting effect. Rachel's footsteps echoed loudly, a reminder of the oppressive silence that enveloped the place. Security cameras followed her every move, a constant reminder that she was being watched. The sterile smell of antiseptic mixed with the faint odor of something metallic, creating an unsettling backdrop to their work. But as Rachel delved deeper into the research, ethical dilemmas began to surface. The government's intentions were shrouded in darkness, and her internal conflict grew. The project was ambitious, but the methods were questionable. They were playing God, tampering with the very essence of humanity. Each day, Rachel felt the weight of her choices pressing down on her, but she pushed forward, driven by the need to succeed where she had once failed. Late at night, she would sit alone in her office, surrounded by stacks of research papers and half-finished experiments, her mind racing with the implications of their work. The fluorescent light overhead flickered occasionally, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. The isolation of the facility, both physical and moral, gnawed at her. She found herself questioning not just the project, but her own motivations. The experiment began with meticulous precision. Rachel and her team subjected Subject X, a seemingly ordinary man, to a series of genetic modifications and psychological conditioning sessions. Initially, the results were promising. Subject X exhibited remarkable physical strength, agility, and cognitive abilities. But there was an unsettling aura about him, a predatory gleam in his eyes that Rachel couldn't shake off. His responses were often tinged with a hint of something darker, something that sent a chill down her spine. One evening, as Rachel reviewed the day's data in the dim glow of her office lamp, a loud crash echoed through the facility. Papers fluttered to the floor as she jumped to her feet. Rushing to the observation room, she found Subject X's containment chamber in disarray. The reinforced glass was spiderwebbed with cracks, and the room was filled with the acrid smell of burnt electronics. The flickering lights cast eerie shadows, making the scene even more surreal. Subject X's eyes, usually cold and calculating, now glowed with an eerie, unnatural light. A barely audible growl escaped his lips, sending chills down Rachel's spine. The room fell silent as he lashed out violently, his strength overwhelming the guards. The team watched in horror as the once promising subject devolved into a beastly figure. The guards' screams echoed in the confined space, their bodies flung like rag dolls against the walls. Subject X's appearance began to change subtly but disturbingly. His muscles bulged unnaturally, his skin taking on a pallid, almost translucent quality. Veins stood out in sharp relief, pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. Rachel couldn't help but feel a creeping dread as she observed these transformations. His once human features became distorted, his eyes reflecting a malevolent intelligence. The sight was both fascinating and horrifying, a testament to the power and danger of their work. Rachel's hands trembled as she recorded the changes. "This isn't what we intended," she whispered to herself, her voice shaking. Her eyes widened, reflecting the growing horror as she watched Subject X's transformation. Dr. Blake, standing beside her, nodded grimly. "We've opened Pandora's box, Rachel, and I'm not sure we can close it." His voice was heavy with resignation, his eyes hollow with fear. The team's initial excitement turned to fear as Subject X's behavior became increasingly erratic. He exhibited signs of extreme aggression, and his cognitive abilities seemed to enhance in frightening ways. He could anticipate their moves, understand their plans. The containment procedures, which once seemed foolproof, now felt like a flimsy barrier against an unstoppable force. "Dr. Kingston, we need to reconsider our approach," Dr. Blake said one evening, his voice low and filled with tension. "We're dealing with something far beyond our control." His brow furrowed and his eyes darted nervously around the room. Rachel nodded, her mind racing with the implications. "We need to gather more data," she said, though she knew deep down that data 6 alone wouldn't solve their problems. Her voice was steady, but her heart pounded with a growing sense of dread. As the days passed, the atmosphere in the facility grew increasingly tense. Staff members whispered about the strange occurrences, their eyes filled with fear and suspicion. Rachel could feel the weight of their expectations and their dread, pressing down on her like a physical force. The once sterile hallways now seemed to pulse with a life of their own, each shadow a potential threat. The air was thick with an unspoken terror, and the walls seemed to close in, suffocating the hope that once thrived there. Then came the deaths. Unexplained, horrific deaths. The first victim, a young lab technician named David, was found with his face twisted in an expression of sheer terror, his body contorted in ways that defied natural anatomy. His limbs were bent at unnatural angles, and his eyes, wide open, seemed to follow those who discovered him. The facility's atmosphere grew heavy with fear, and the line between nightmare and reality began to blur for the staff. The sight of David's lifeless body was seared into Rachel's mind, a constant reminder of the stakes they faced. Subject X had evolved beyond mere physical enhancements. He developed terrifying psychological powers, telepathy, the ability to induce hallucinations, and most chillingly, he fed on fear. With each terrified victim, he grew stronger, more menacing. The team observed how his presence seemed to distort reality, creating an oppressive atmosphere that made it hard to think clearly. The air itself seemed to hum with malevolence, a constant reminder of the danger that lurked within. Rachel and her team noticed the correlation between the increasing fear within the facility and Subject X's escalating power. The air was thick with paranoia, accusations flying as alliances formed and shattered. The staff's sanity began to unravel, and Rachel found herself struggling to maintain a grip on reality. The facility, once a beacon of scientific promise, had become a place of horror and madness. 7 Dr. Kingston, I keep seeing things, horrible things, Karen confessed one evening, her eyes wide with terror. I saw Dr. Blake. He was skinned alive. Her voice trembled, and her hands shook as she clutched her lab coat. It's just your mind playing tricks, Karen, Rachel said, though she wasn't entirely sure herself. Stay focused. We need to understand what we're dealing with. She placed a reassuring hand on Karen's shoulder, though her own heart was racing. The facility's hallways became a maze of shadows and whispers. The walls seemed to close in, and the fluorescent lights flickered ominously, casting unsettling patterns on the floor. Every creak and groan of the building set nerves on edge. Staff members huddled together, speaking in hushed tones, their eyes darting to every shadow. The once sterile environment now had an almost sentient malevolence about it. Every shadow seemed to harbor a threat, every corner a potential ambush. The walls, once gleaming and white, now seemed to pulse with a sinister life, the faint stains of blood and sweat a testament to the mounting horrors. Rachel's resolve hardened. She needed to uncover the truth behind Subject X's creation. Late one night, she ventured into the deepest, most forgotten corners of the facility. The archives were located in a sub-basement, a place rarely visited. Dust coated the shelves, and the air was thick with the musty smell of old paper. The fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. As she navigated the narrow aisles, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, she stumbled upon a section marked Top Secret. The files were old, their edges yellowed and brittle. With trembling hands, she opened the first folder. What she found chilled her to the bone. The documents detailed previous unethical experiments on human subjects. The files were filled with grisly details, photographs of deformed and suffering individuals, and notes from scientists who had long since disappeared. The revelations were monstrous. 8 Subject X was the culmination of decades of dark science, a Pandora's box of genetic horrors. Each file she opened was worse than the last, a testament to the depths of human depravity in the pursuit of progress. Rachel's moral dilemma reached its peak. She confided in Dr. Blake, Major Harris, and Karen, revealing the dark history she had uncovered. "We've been lied to," she said, her voice shaking. "This project, it's built on a foundation of suffering and death." Her eyes, filled with anger and fear, locked onto theirs, seeking understanding and support. Dr. Blake's face turned pale as he leafed through the documents. "This is beyond anything I imagined. We're not just tampering with genetics, Rachel. We're unleashing something far more sinister." His voice was a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would summon the horrors described in the files. "We need to stop this," Major Harris said, his jaw set in determination, "before it's too late." His eyes, usually so cold and hard, now burned with a sense of urgency and resolve. Together, they devised a desperate plan to contain or neutralize Subject X. The odds of success were slim, and the consequences of failure unthinkable. They gathered in a small, dimly lit room, the air thick with tension. Maps and schematics were spread out on the table, and their faces were illuminated by the flickering light of a single bulb. "We'll use the facility's failsafe," Harris said, pointing to a section of the map. "It's risky, but it's our best shot." Rachel nodded, her mind racing with calculations and contingencies. "We have to be precise. One mistake and we're all dead." Her voice was steady, but her hands shook as she traced the lines on the map. The plan was set, but as they prepared, the sense of impending doom only grew. Subject X was becoming more powerful by the 9 hour, and the facility itself seemed to groan under the weight of the horror it contained. The once reassuring hum of machinery now sounded like the growl of a lurking beast ready to pounce. Before being known as Subject X, the man was once a soldier named Michael Taylor. Taylor had a family, a wife and 2 young children. His service record was exemplary. He had shown remarkable bravery and leadership in several high-stakes missions. However, the military's psychological assessments revealed a darker side, repressed rage, and a traumatic past that made him a prime candidate for the Super Soldier Project. Michael's wife, Emily, was unaware of the true nature of his deployment. She received letters regularly, filled with loving words and promises of return, but beneath the surface, Michael struggled with his transformation. The genetic modifications began to take a toll, not just physically, but mentally. His letters became sporadic and filled with disjointed thoughts, a clear sign that the project was affecting his sanity. Emily's worry grew, sensing that something was terribly wrong. Inside the facility, the daily operations were a blend of military discipline and scientific experimentation. Security protocols were stringent. Access to different sections of the facility required multiple layers of clearance. The staff underwent rigorous psychological evaluations regularly, ensuring they could handle the stress and moral ambiguity of their work. The labs were equipped with cutting-edge technology, albeit outdated by today's standards. Glass tanks filled with strange luminescent fluids lined the walls, each containing biological samples in various stages of mutation. The air was filled with a constant low hum of machines, punctuated occasionally by the sharp hiss of pressurized doors opening and closing. The cafeteria was a stark contrast to the rest of the facility, brightly lit with communal tables. It was a place where the staff tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy. Conversations here were often strained, with a palpable tension as everyone tried to ignore the ethical shadow looming over their work. Every meal was a reminder of the isolation and the weight of the secrets they were keeping. Karen, despite her enthusiasm, began to feel the strain of the work. The initial excitement of being part of a groundbreaking project was overshadowed by the ethical dilemmas and the increasingly dangerous nature of Subject X. She started keeping a journal, documenting her thoughts and fears. She wrote about the first time she saw Subject X up close, describing the unsettling aura he exuded. His eyes, she wrote, they don't just see you, they see through you, like he's probing your soul. It's terrifying. Her entries grew darker, filled with doubts about the morality of their work and the fear that they were on the brink of creating something uncontrollable. Karen confided in Rachel, who offered words of comfort, but could not dispel her own growing unease. They often spent late nights discussing the project, their conversations shifting from scientific jargon to philosophical debates about the nature of humanity and the cost of scientific advancement. These discussions only deepened Karen's conviction that they were treading dangerous waters. Dr. Samuel Blake's death was not just a turning point for the team, but also a moment of profound personal loss for Rachel. Blake had been more than a colleague. He had been a mentor and a friend. His sacrifice haunted her, his final moments playing over and over in her mind. Blake had known the risks. In the days leading up to his death, he had become increasingly withdrawn, spending long hours in the lab reviewing data and making notes. He knew the project was spiraling out of control and had started working on a contingency plan, a way to neutralize Subject X if things went wrong. His last act of heroism was not just about triggering the lockdown, but ensuring that Rachel and Karen had the best chance of 11 surviving. In his final moments, he had whispered to Rachel, "You have to finish this, for all of us." Those words became her mantra, driving her to see the mission through to the end. The nightmare reached its zenith when Subject X broke free from his containment. Chaos erupted as alarms blared, lights flickered and died, and the facility descended into a hellish labyrinth. The corridors, once sterile and orderly, were now blood-soaked and filled with the echoes of screams. The walls seemed to close in, and the air grew thick with the scent of fear and death. Every step Rachel took echoed ominously, blending with the distant, haunting cries of the damned. The fluorescent lights, struggling against the overwhelming darkness, cast intermittent beams that only accentuated the growing chaos. Rachel and her small group navigated the dark, claustrophobic halls, encountering grotesque mutations and twisted horrors at every turn. Subject X had turned the facility into a hunting ground, manipulating their deepest fears and driving them to the brink of madness. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with malevolent intent, the shadows morphing into monstrous shapes that taunted them. Dr. Blake was the first to fall. As they rounded a corner, they found themselves face to face with a nightmarish vision. Subject X had distorted the corridor into a twisted, hellish landscape. Dr. Blake, his face a mask of terror, was ensnared by tendrils of darkness that wrapped around his limbs and torso, pulling him into the abyss. His screams echoed through the facility, a chilling reminder of the horrors they faced. "No, Samuel!" Rachel screamed, her voice breaking as she reached out, but it was too late. Blake's body was torn apart, the tendrils retreating into the shadows with their grisly prize. "We have to keep moving," Major Harris said, his voice steady but eyes betraying the fear he felt. "Blake's sacrifice won't be in vain." They pressed on, their resolve hardened but their hearts heavy. 12 each step brought new terrors, each shadow a potential death sentence. Subject X's telepathic assaults were relentless, conjuring visions of past failures and lost loved ones, each illusion designed to break their spirits. Rachel's mind was bombarded with images of her past failures. The young girl she couldn't save, the patients who had suffered because of her experiments. She saw their faces, twisted in agony, blaming her for their pain. It took every ounce of her willpower to push these visions aside and focus on the task at hand. Major Harris, too, met a grisly end. As they reached the facility's central control room, Harris took point, determined to secure their path. But Subject X was waiting. In a horrific display of power, he manipulated the environment, causing the walls to close in and the floor to give way. Harris fell into a pit of darkness, his final moments filled with heroic defiance as he used his last breath to trigger the facility's emergency lockdown. "Go!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the chamber. "Finish this!" Rachel and Karen were now alone, the weight of their losses pressing down on them. The facility, once a beacon of scientific promise, was now a labyrinth of nightmares. The air was thick with the scent of blood and decay, and the sounds of distant screams reverberated through the corridors. The oppressive darkness seemed almost tangible, pressing in on them from all sides. The psychological toll on the team was immense. The constant fear and the moral implications of their work began to take a toll on everyone. Insomnia became rampant, with many of the staff resorting to sedatives to get even a few hours of sleep. Nightmares were common, filled with visions of Subject X and the horrors they had witnessed. Rachel found herself struggling to maintain her composure. She, 13, began to experience bouts of paranoia, convinced that Subject X could somehow reach into her mind even from his containment. She isolated herself, fearing that her growing instability would affect her judgment. Karen, too, was not immune. The once bright-eyed assistant began to show signs of severe stress. Her hands trembled constantly, and dark circles formed under her eyes. The journal that had once been her solace became a grim record of her descent into fear and doubt. As the facility prepared for the final confrontation, the tension was palpable. The remaining staff moved with a sense of purpose, but beneath the surface there was a collective sense of dread. The halls that had once buzzed with scientific discovery now felt like the corridors of a doomed ship, each step echoing the inevitability of their fate. The electromagnetic cage was a marvel of engineering, a last-ditch effort to contain the uncontainable. Rachel and Karen worked tirelessly to calibrate the equipment, their hands moving with precision even as their minds raced with fear. The hum of the machines became a constant backdrop, a reminder of the power they were about to unleash. The moment Subject X appeared, it was clear that this was no ordinary battle. The air crackled with energy, and the very fabric of reality seemed to warp around them. Rachel's heart pounded as she faced the creature, her mind a whirlwind of calculations and fear. Subject X's final roar was a sound that Rachel knew she would never forget, a mix of rage, pain, and something almost human. The explosion that followed was like nothing she had ever experienced, a blinding flash of light and energy that seemed to tear through the very essence of the facility. The final showdown was inevitable. Rachel lured Subject X into a carefully laid trap, using her deep knowledge of genetics to exploit his vulnerabilities. The control room, with its flickering monitors and humming machines, became their battleground. Rachel had 14 reconfigured the room to create an electromagnetic cage designed to contain and weaken Subject X. As she activated the trap, the room was bathed in a harsh blue light. Subject X appeared, his form flickering between human and monstrous, his eyes glowing with malevolent intelligence. The air crackled with tension, the electromagnetic field distorting reality itself. Rachel faced her own deepest fears, using them to bait the creature into a vulnerable position. Subject X was cunning, his telepathic assaults relentless. He conjured visions of Rachel's past failures, her lost loved ones, each illusion designed to break her spirit. She saw the young girl from her previous project, her body twisted and broken, accusing eyes burning into Rachel's soul. But Rachel's determination was unyielding. She fought back with every ounce of strength she had, using her scientific acumen as a weapon. "I won't let you win," Rachel said through gritted teeth, her hands trembling as she adjusted the controls. "Not after everything." The battle was fierce, a clash of wills and wits. Rachel identified and targeted a genetic weakness, each strike a desperate gamble. Subject X roared in pain and fury, his form convulsing as the electromagnetic field intensified. The air was filled with the acrid smell of burning flesh and the high-pitched whine of the machinery straining against the creature's power. "Karen, now!" Rachel shouted, her voice strained with effort. Karen, tears streaming down her face, activated the final sequence. The room's temperature plummeted, and the machines hummed louder, their combined power focused on a single point. Rachel plunged a specially designed serum into Subject X, targeting the genetic aberration that fueled his monstrous powers. The creature howled, its form fracturing and dissolving into a cascade of light and shadow. 15 with a final deafening roar, Subject X exploded into a burst of energy, the shockwave rippling through the facility. Rachel and Karen were thrown to the ground, the room collapsing around them. As the dust settled, the silence was deafening. The oppressive weight of Subject X's presence lifted, replaced by an eerie stillness. The facility was consumed in a controlled explosion, a fiery cleansing of the nightmare that had unfolded within its walls. Rachel and Karen, scarred but alive, escaped the inferno, their hearts heavy with the weight of what they had witnessed. The cool night air hit them like a blessing, the stars overhead a stark contrast to the hell they had emerged from. The distant sound of sirens signaled the arrival of emergency personnel, but for Rachel and Karen, the nightmare was far from over. Survivors faced a barrage of questions from government officials, their futures uncertain. The authorities, faces stern and voices demanding, wanted to know every detail. Rachel's reflections were haunted by the faces of the lost, the ethical consequences of their experiment a heavy burden on her soul. Each question brought back the horrors they had faced, the sacrifices made. The memories of Drs. Blake and Major Harris were particularly painful. Their deaths a constant reminder of the cost of their ambition. "We were trying to create something extraordinary," Rachel said, her voice hollow, "but we unleashed a nightmare." The potential existence of similar projects loomed like a dark cloud. The lingering threat of hidden horrors drove Rachel to a decision. She resolved to expose the truth, risking her career, her freedom, and her safety to prevent future atrocities. The need for vigilance and accountability was paramount. Karen, standing by her side, nodded in agreement. "We can't let this happen again. We have to make sure the world knows." In the end, Rachel's determination to prevent such horrors from recurring was unwavering. She stood on the precipice of a new 16 beginning, her mind filled with a somber, cautionary resolve. The horrors of the past were a constant reminder of the fragility of humanity's moral compass, but also of the glimmer of hope for change and redemption. She knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but with Karen by her side, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Together they would face whatever came next, armed with the knowledge of their past and the hope for a better future. The next few days were a blur of debriefings and interrogations. Rachel and Karen were kept in a secure facility, away from prying eyes and the media. Government officials, psychologists, and military personnel paraded through the sterile interview rooms, each demanding detailed accounts of the events. Every retelling of the horrors they had witnessed felt like ripping open fresh wounds, but Rachel remained resolute. The truth had to be known. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the room, Rachel sat alone, reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. The faces of Dr. Blake and Major Harris haunted her, their sacrifices etched into her memory. She thought of the young girl whose life had been destroyed by her previous project, and she vowed that she would not let their suffering be in vain. Karen entered the room, carrying 2 cups of steaming coffee. She handed one to Rachel and sat down beside her. "We've been through hell," she said quietly, staring into the dark liquid. Rachel nodded, taking a sip of the bitter coffee. "Yes, we have. But we survived, and now we have to make sure this never happens again." Karen's eyes were filled with determination. "I've been thinking about what comes next. We can't just walk away from this." "No, we can't," Rachel agreed. "We need to expose what happened, ensure that these experiments are shut down for good, but we'll need allies, people who believe in what we're doing." 17, they spent hours planning their next steps, reaching out to contacts and allies who could help them in their mission. Journalists, scientists, and activists who shared their vision for a world free of such horrors. Slowly but surely, a network began to form, a coalition of voices ready to speak out against the dark forces that had been at work in the Richmond facility. The day of the press conference arrived. Rachel and Karen stood in front of a packed room, the hum of anticipation filling the air. The faces of reporters and camera crews stared back at them, eager for the story that would undoubtedly shake the foundations of scientific ethics and government accountability. Rachel took a deep breath, stepping up to the podium. The bright lights of the cameras made it hard to see, but she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here today. What we are about to reveal will change everything you thought you knew about scientific research and government oversight." She began recounting the events, sparing no detail. The crowd listened in stunned silence as she described the unethical experiments, the rise of Subject X, and the harrowing battle to contain him. She spoke of the lives lost, the sacrifices made, and the moral quandaries they had faced. Karen stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. "We cannot allow this to happen again. The darkness that we encountered in that facility must be brought to light. We owe it to the victims, to those who suffered and died, to ensure that this never happens again. The press conference sparked a firestorm of media coverage and public outcry. Investigations were launched, and the government was forced to confront the consequences of its secretive projects. Rachel and Karen became symbols of ethical resistance, their bravery inspiring others to stand up against scientific and governmental malfeasance. 18 months later, Rachel found herself standing at the edge of a cliff overlooking the ocean. The wind whipped through her hair, the salty air a reminder of the world she had almost lost herself in. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, the battles fought and the lives lost. She thought of the future, of the world she hoped to help build, one where science and ethics walked hand in hand. Karen joined her, standing silently for a moment before speaking. "Do you ever wonder what's next?" Rachel smiled faintly. "Every day, but I believe that we've made a difference, and that's what matters." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Rachel felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The shadows of the past would never fully fade, but she had found a way to turn them into a beacon of hope for the future. The shadows of the Richmond facility would never fade entirely, but Rachel Kingston would ensure that the light of truth would shine through, a beacon against the darkness of human hubris. With Karen by her side, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Together they would face whatever came next, armed with the knowledge of their past and the hope for a better future. And in that hope, they found the strength to continue their journey one step at a time into the unknown.